Professor, for that, and folks will have an opportunity to ask the questions at the end. I'm going to now call Nader Hashemi, who is the Associate Professor and Director of the Al-Walid Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding right here at Georgetown University. Professor.
Well, let me begin by thanking Radwan and his team for putting this conference together. We're happy to be sort of co-sponsoring this event. The CSID annual conference has sort of become like a family, second family for us. So I'm happy to be back to offer some remarks. I don't have a coherent and well thought of presentation. I just have some scattered remarks that I want to present to you. And the title of my presentation is Reflections on Gaza, Why Palestinian National Liberation is Inseparable from Arab Regional Democratization. And so what I'm really interested in is three issues. One, the question of Palestinian national rights, Palestinian self-determination, and of course the question of democracy in the Middle East, and how these two things are linked and how they go together. And now, of course, the question of Gaza is on all of our minds. So I'm trying to think through the relationship between these ideas, these themes, these aspects of Middle East and Islamic politics. So October 7th, the October 7th crisis in Israel-Palestine is a watershed and transformative moment in both global politics and the politics of the region in the Middle East. While much of the intellectual and policy commentary on this crisis is focused on Hamas, the Israeli government, the Biden administration, the role of Arab states has evaded critical scrutiny. And what I want to do is try and fill this gap a little bit in my presentation this morning against the backdrop of the Gaza crisis. I want to critically analyze or say some critical things about leading Arab states, both before and after October the 7th. I want to focus some of my remarks on a critical evaluation of the Abraham Accords, which set the stage, in my view, to the October 7th crisis. The record suggests, I think, that if you look at what's happening right now, that there's a degree of complicity by some of these Arab states in what's going on in Gaza today. This can best be explained by the nature of authoritarian politics in the Arab world that is deeply fearful of independent Palestinian nationalism and, grassroots insurgents movements. And these Arab states look toward Israel as a guarantor of the authoritarian status quo in the Middle East. One of the key lessons from Gaza, or the Gaza crisis, I would like to provocatively argue, is that Palestinian self-determination is deeply connected and perhaps dependent on some future Arab political transformation away from authoritarianism and in the direction of democracy. These two processes, I believe, are deeply connected. They're intertwined. They can't be artificially separated. At the very least, some serious movement toward democracy in the Arab world would significantly increase the prospects of advancing Palestinian national rights and a lasting peace in the region between Israelis and Palestinians. So what I'm about to argue is considered to be blasphemous in the context of the U.S. foreign policy debate, the mainstream U.S. foreign policy debate. You're not supposed to say these things, even think these things. But I want to radically reframe the relationship between Arab states, Israel, and the question of Palestine in the context of the Abraham Accord framework, which really bring these two things together. Nonetheless, given how bad the situation is in Gaza, that's what's really motivating me to sort of think through this particular topic, to think outside of the box, to think long term. This is not any short term I don't have any short term analysis or solutions to what's happening in the region. So we're all aware of what's happening in Gaza. The more I look at it, the more every day passes by, the situation continues to produce a horror show. And of course, what's so tragic about the situation in Gaza today is that notwithstanding the last 6 months of horror, in many ways, one can make an argument that perhaps the worst is yet to come, particularly if Israel decides to move into Rafah. The number of children killed is one of the distinguishing characteristics of happening in Gaza. I just read a UN report yesterday that said every 10 minutes in Gaza, one child is either killed or wounded. One of the unique aspects of the war in Gaza, the genocide in Gaza, unlike any other mass atrocities, is that the Palestinians have nowhere to flee to. If you compare what's happening in Gaza to other cases of genocide, in many of those cases, there was an option of people fleeing the horror. The bombing raids that Israel has conducted with U.S. support, the weaponization of food as a deliberate policy of starvation has produced independent reports by human rights organizations, one after the other, charging the Israeli government of using starvation as a method of warfare. The cultural genocide in Gaza, in terms of the destruction of the cultural heritage, the university systems, the libraries, is one of the underreported aspects of this horror show. And so the more I watch this and the more I look at it, so I'm scratching my head to think, well, what's the way out? What's the way forward? The World Court ruled at the end of January, 15-2, the judges on the World Court, 15 out of the 17 judges, made a ruling that what we're seeing in Gaza is a plausible case of genocide. And if you look at what's happening, the role of the West, the role of the United States, is central to this story. An argument can be made that many of the leaders of the West are complicit in the Gaza horror show. The arms shipments, according to the last time I checked, are still flowing, notwithstanding this situation. And if you just look at the framing of the debate in Gaza, it's so one-sided and it's so biased, and you're all familiar with it. The Palestinians deserve humanitarian aid, and Israel has the right to sort of defend itself because of what happened in October the 7th. In other words, the narrative is, let's give the Palestinians in Gaza one last supper before they die of some communicable disease or in an Israeli bombing raid. But at the same time, let's not stop Israel from doing whatever it wants to protect its security. The Palestinians are not entitled to those same rights to security that we guarantee to Israel. And so the whole framing here is deeply biased. It's pretty clear that when it comes to the West, the value of an Israeli life matters more than a Palestinian life. And so no one really is going to come to the rescue of the Palestinians. Anyone who's waiting for some sort of shift, some sort of future president, some sort of electoral change anywhere in the West that can make a difference in terms of the plight of the Palestinians, that's wishful thinking. So the question then comes, where can we turn to for hope, for perhaps an alternative way forward, for a new opening for the Palestinians and for a genuine lasting peace in the region that would include justice for the Palestinians. And so as I think through this issue, I think we need to focus much more on the Middle East, the Arab world in particular, and the regional context, and how a weakening of authoritarian regimes and the possible rise of democracy movements or democratic transitions might affect the prospects for Palestinian rights and advance a genuine peace process. And recall during the Arab Spring, this issue first came up. There's report after report that when the Arab Spring begins in Egypt, Benjamin Netanyahu starts to panic. And he's repeatedly on the phone calling Obama to not give up on Hosni Mubarak. There was deep fears also, in the West on many quarters in terms of what political transitions, democratic transitions might mean for the future security of the region, particularly for the Israel-Palestine conflict. And Moshe Ahrens, the former Minister of Foreign Affairs and Minister of Defense from the Likud party in Israel, actually reflected on this topic in the early days of the Arab Spring revolt, where he wrote an essay in Haaretz where he contemplated the viability of an Israeli national security doctrine that was predicated on peace with Arab dictators. And he wrote the following, quote, "The ugly facts are that the two peace treaties that Israel concluded so far, the one with Egypt and the other with Jordan, were both signed with dictators, Anwar Sadat and King Hussein. What's more, the negotiations that for a while held some promise of reaching a peace agreement with Syria and with the Palestine Liberation Organization were also conducted with unsavory dictators. The question that Israelis ask themselves at this moment is if Hosni Mubarak's regime were to be replaced by a democratically elected government in Egypt, would this government continue to maintain the nearly 32-year peace treaty with Israel?" End quote. Moshe Ahrens came pretty close to admitting what many scholars of the Middle East and scholars of the Israel-Palestine conflict in particular have known for a very long time, that only a long-term, solid peace agreement that can stand the test of time has to be made not with the dictators of the Arab world, but with the people of the Arab world. And that can only happen if Israel is willing to give some justice to the Palestinians as a precondition for Israel being accepted as some sort of legitimate entity in the eyes of the Arab Islamic world. And of course, to date, no Israeli government, or US government for that matter, has been willing to do this in practical terms. And then we had the Abraham Accords, where we were told, that this was a wonderful sort of way around the question of Palestine. The question of Palestine didn't matter anymore. All we needed to do was focus on normalization agreements. And if you follow the debate here in Washington, D.C., just prior to October the 7th, there was huge euphoria over Saudi-Israeli normalization. I'm pretty sure Blinken and his team were thinking that they're going to win the Nobel Peace Prize if they can pull this off. But remember the basic nature and ideological orientation of the Abraham Accords. It was based on several core pillars that were built into the DNA of this agreement. That the Abraham Accords is not a peace deal. The Abraham Accords was not really a peace deal, as I said, between Israel and the Arab world. It was a peace deal between Israel and Arab dictators. The question of Palestine didn't matter to the Abraham Accords. Jared Kushner, the key architect, openly stated this when he announced the Abraham Accords. The persistence of Arab authoritarianism was a central part of the Abraham Accords. You couldn't ask Arab publics to participate in any deliberation because they wanted justice for the Palestinians, and you're not going to get that under this current arrangement. Israel wasn't going to give any justice to the Palestinians, and the Arab dictators were just going to, keep the population in check. That was built into the Abraham Accords. Got it. And so that's the sort of status quo. That's the situation, before October the 7th. In other words, autocracy in the Arab world is a necessary precondition for the success of the Abraham Accords. And just imagine the reverse scenario for a moment, that let's say there was actually an open civil society, there was public accountability in the Arab world on questions related to Israeli-Palestinian peace and the question of justice. No Arab public would allow for any sort of peace treaty with Israel to go forward unless there was something in it for the Palestinians, which is why you can only have the Abraham Accords with dictatorial regimes. You can't have it with an Arab democracy. And of course, this is a position that the United States is perfectly happy with. The European Union is perfectly happy with this. The Abraham Accords, have been supported by Western powers based on this arrangement. In other words, authoritarianism is in the DNA of the Abraham Accords. It's the oxygen that fuels it and sustains it. You remove it, and the entire edifice collapses. So, looking forward, and I'm going to wrap up here because my time is up. Looking forward, and given the fundamental fact that what we've been seeing over the last 6 months in Gaza suggests that, there is no serious Western resolve to support Palestinian rights. I can't see it coming anytime soon. The West will continue to maintain this double standard where Israel's security matters much more than Palestinian security. And so the only way forward seems to me that might produce some hope is the weakening of authoritarian regimes in the Arab world that could perhaps open doors for Palestinian rights. Arab autocracies fundamentally at the end of the day are on Israel's side. And if you follow what's been happening right now, they're vocally supportive of the Palestinians, but privately when Blinken comes into town, they say, finish the job, Israel, because they have a deep fear and a self-interest in making sure that that Hamas and any sort of popular insurgency from below is not victorious because of the example that might set for the rest of the region. So perhaps looking forward, in conclusion, democratic Arab states, were they to exist at some point down the road, would force Israel to make serious concessions before a long-standing peace agreement could be established as a precondition for a broader, sort of stable and more just political order in the Middle East. So that's what I'm thinking about. I realize this is a tall order, but I don't think authoritarianism in the Arab world is sustainable over the long term. It's not going to happen, particularly in countries in North Africa. I think these are short-term calculations that the West has made, and I think at the end of the day, those calculations will not stand up to critical scrutiny as populations start to revolt over the repressive status quo that defines their reality. Thank you.